Sarah's hands trembled as she swiped through profiles on the dating app. Each face that flickered on her screen seemed to stare back at her with vacant eyes, judging her loneliness. The glow of her phone was the only source of light in her small, cluttered apartment, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her friends had urged her to give online dating a try. "It's the best way to meet people these days," they said. But Sarah had always been hesitant. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she didn't want to end up like the countless horror stories she'd heard. Tonight, though, something felt different. There was a sense of unease in the air, as if the universe was whispering warnings she couldn't quite understand. She took a deep breath and continued swiping. Then she saw him. His name was Mark, and his profile was unremarkable at first glance. Brown hair, blue eyes, a friendly smile. But there was something in his eyes that drew her in. They seemed to hold secrets, depths that she couldn't resist exploring. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the like button. She shrugged off her apprehension and tapped the screen. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a new message. "Hi Sarah, nice to meet you. Your profile caught my eye. Would you like to chat?" Her heart skipped a beat. She typed a quick reply, and before she knew it, they were deep in conversation. Mark was charming, witty, and attentive. He seemed genuinely interested in her, asking questions about her life, her interests, and her dreams. They chatted late into the night, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Days turned into weeks, and their conversations grew more intimate. They shared their fears, their pasts, and their hopes for the future. Mark seemed perfect, almost too perfect. But Sarah pushed aside her doubts, convincing herself that she deserved to be happy. One evening, as they were chatting, Mark suggested they meet in person. Sarah's heart raced with excitement and anxiety. She agreed, and they made plans to meet at a cozy little cafe in the city. The night of their date, Sarah stood in front of her mirror, nervously adjusting her outfit. She wanted to look perfect for Mark, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She shook her head, dismissing her fears as predate jitters, and headed out the door. The cafe was dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. Sarah found a table near the window and sat down, her eyes scanning the room for Mark. A few minutes later, she saw him walk in. He was even more handsome in person, his smile lighting up the room. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm and inviting. She stood up, smiling nervously. "Mark, it's so good to finally meet you." They hugged briefly, and Mark pulled out a chair for her. As they sat down, their conversation flowed effortlessly, just like it had online. But as the evening wore on, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in Mark's demeanor. His eyes seemed darker, his smile more forced. There was an intensity about him that made her uneasy. Sarah excused herself to go to the restroom, needing a moment to collect her thoughts. As she washed her hands, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. "You're being paranoid," she whispered to herself. "He's just a normal guy." When she returned to the table, Mark's demeanor seemed to have softened, and she pushed aside her doubts once again. They finished their meal and decided to take a walk in the nearby park. The park was almost deserted, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. They strolled along the path, talking and laughing, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, Mark stopped walking and turned to face her. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you." Her heart pounded in her chest. "What is it, Mark?" He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "I've been keeping something from you. There's a reason I wanted to meet you tonight, in person." Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Was he married? Did he have a dark past? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark stepped closer, his expression intense. "Sarah, I think you're in danger. And I need to protect you." A chill ran down her spine. "What are you talking about?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket. "This belonged to my sister. She disappeared a year ago after meeting someone online. I found this locket in her apartment, and it led me to you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What? How could that be?" Mark looked around nervously. "I don't know, but I have a feeling that whoever took her is now after you." Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" "I didn't want to scare you off. But now, I think we're running out of time." Before she could respond, a sudden gust of wind blew through the park, and the streetlights flickered ominously. Sarah's skin prickled with fear as she felt an icy presence nearby. "Mark, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We need to get out of here. Now." They started to run, the shadows around them seeming to grow and twist. As they reached the edge of the park, Sarah glanced back and saw a figure standing in the darkness, watching them. Her heart raced as they made their way to Mark's car. He fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the doors, and they jumped in. Mark started the engine and sped off, leaving the park and the mysterious figure behind. As they drove through the deserted streets, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. She turned to Mark, her voice filled with urgency. "What do we do now?" "We need to find somewhere safe," he said, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "I have a cabin a few hours from here. We can go there and figure out our next move." Sarah nodded, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The car sped through the night, the tension between them thick and suffocating. She couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake trusting Mark. They drove for what felt like hours, the darkness outside the car growing more oppressive with each passing mile. Finally, they reached a remote, wooded area, and Mark turned onto a narrow dirt road. The cabin was small and rustic, nestled among the trees. Mark parked the car and they hurried inside, locking the door behind them. The air inside was cold and musty, but it felt safer than the open road. Mark lit a fire in the small stone fireplace, and the flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah sat on the worn couch, her mind racing with questions. "Mark, what do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He sat down beside her, his expression grim. "We need to figure out who or what is after you. And we need to be prepared for anything." As they sat in the dimly lit cabin, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Who could be after her? And why? She couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something or someone was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night wore on, and Sarah struggled to stay awake, her exhaustion battling with her fear. Mark kept watch, his eyes never leaving the window. Just as she was about to drift off, a loud crash echoed through the cabin, jolting her awake. Mark jumped to his feet, his eyes wide with alarm. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the door. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him disappear into the darkness. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. She strained to hear any sound, but the silence was deafening. Suddenly, the flashlight beam flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she heard the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body was frozen with fear. The footsteps grew louder, and she could see a shadowy figure approaching the cabin. She clutched the edge of the couch, her knuckles turning white. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as the figure moved closer, the darkness obscuring their face. As the figure reached out, a beam of moonlight illuminated their face. It was Mark, his eyes wide with fear. "Sarah, we need to go. Now." She didn't hesitate. They grabbed their bags and rushed out of the cabin, the cold night air biting at their skin. They ran to the car, but as they reached it, they saw that the tires had been slashed. Panic surged through Sarah as she turned to Mark. "What do we do now?" He looked around frantically, his mind racing. "There's a town about 5 miles from here. We need to get there and find help." They set off on foot, the darkness surrounding them like a shroud. The forest was eerily silent, the only sounds their labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle a sign of danger. As they walked, Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, his tension palpable. Sarah's mind raced with questions, but she knew now was not the time for answers. They needed to survive the night. Hours passed, and their progress was slow and torturous. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, and Sarah's fear grew with each step. Just as her legs felt like they could go no further, they saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. Hope surged within her as they hurried toward the town. But as they reached the outskirts, their relief was short-lived. The town was eerily quiet, the streets deserted and the buildings dark. "Where is everyone?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Mark shook his head, his eyes scanning the empty streets. "I don't know, but we need to find shelter." They made their way through the town, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As they approached a small, abandoned house, a feeling of dread washed over Sarah. She knew they had no choice but to seek refuge, but the house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Mark pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. They found a small room at the back of the house and barricaded themselves inside. Sarah's heart raced as they sat in the darkness, the oppressive silence broken only by their ragged breaths. She glanced at Mark, his face etched with worry. "Mark, what's happening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, his eyes haunted. "I don't know, but we need to stay strong. We'll get through this." As the night wore on, the tension between them grew unbearable. They huddled together, their fear a tangible presence in the room. Sarah's mind raced with questions, but she knew now was not the time for answers. They needed to survive the night. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, and Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Mark grabbed her hand, his grip tight and reassuring. "Stay close," he whispered. They crept toward the source of the noise, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the front of the house, they saw a figure standing in the doorway, shrouded in darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, the moonlight illuminating their face. It was a woman, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "They're coming." Before Sarah could respond, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, and the woman was yanked back into the darkness. The door slammed shut, leaving Sarah and Mark in stunned silence. "We need to get out of here," Mark said urgently, his eyes wide with fear. They ran through the house, their footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. As they reached the back door, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as they burst through the door and into the night. They ran through the empty streets, the darkness closing in around them. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle a sign of danger. As they reached the edge of town, they saw a car parked by the side of the road. Mark hurried over and tried the door, but it was locked. "Help! Is anyone there?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the night. A figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by darkness. Sarah's heart raced as the figure approached, their movements slow and deliberate. "Please, we need help," she pleaded, her voice trembling. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a tall, imposing man with a stern expression. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cold and suspicious. "We're being chased," Mark said urgently. "We need to get out of here." The man eyed them warily, his expression unreadable. After a tense moment, he nodded and unlocked the car door. "Get in." They hurried into the car, their hearts pounding with fear and relief. As the man started the engine, Sarah glanced out the window and saw the shadowy figure watching them from the edge of town. "Who was that?" she whispered, her voice filled with dread. The man glanced at her, his expression grim. "You don't want to know." They drove through the night, the oppressive silence weighing heavily on them. Sarah's mind raced with questions, but she knew now was not the time for answers. They needed to survive the night. As the sun began to rise, they reached a small, secluded motel. The man parked the car and turned to them, his expression serious. "Stay here and don't leave the room," he instructed. "I'll be back with help." Mark nodded, his face etched with worry. "Thank you." They hurried into the motel room and locked the door behind them. The room was small and dingy, but it felt like a haven after the horrors they had faced. Sarah sank onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Mark sat beside her, his expression grim. "We're safe for now," he said softly, his eyes filled with determination. "But we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. As she glanced out the window, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the darkness, she knew their ordeal was far from over. They had survived the night, but the true horror was only just beginning. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her body still trembling with exhaustion and fear. The motel room's dingy walls closed in on her, and the faint smell of mildew permeated the air. Mark sat beside her, his face etched with worry. He stared at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The man who had driven them here had left with a promise to return with help. But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that the shadowy figure from the town was somehow still tracking them. "Sarah, are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. She nodded, though she didn't feel okay. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few hours over and over. I don't understand any of this, Mark. Who were those people? Why are they after us?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I wish I knew. But we need to stay strong, Sarah. We need to be ready for anything." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "What do we do now? Do we just wait here?" Mark shook his head. "No. We need to be proactive. We need to find out more about what's happening and why." He stood up and began to pace the small room. Sarah watched him, feeling a mix of fear and determination. She knew he was right. They couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever was out there to find them. "We should look around the motel," Mark said, his voice firm. "Maybe there's something here that can help us." Sarah nodded and stood up, feeling a surge of determination. "Let's do it." They moved cautiously through the motel, checking each room for any signs of danger or useful information. The place was eerily silent, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. As they searched, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Every creak and groan of the old building made her heart race. In one of the rooms, they found a small office. Mark rummaged through the desk drawers while Sarah checked the shelves. Her fingers brushed against a dusty old ledger, and she pulled it out, coughing as a cloud of dust enveloped her. "Look at this," she said, showing the ledger to Mark. "It looks like some kind of guest book." Mark took it from her, flipping through the pages. His eyes widened as he scanned the entries. "Sarah, look at these dates. They're all recent. And some of these names, they match the profiles of people who have gone missing." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "You mean the people who disappeared after meeting someone online?" Mark nodded grimly. "Yes. This can't be a coincidence." As they continued to search the office, they found more disturbing evidence. Photos of people who had gone missing, printed out profiles from dating apps, and detailed notes on their habits and routines. It was clear that someone had been meticulously tracking these people. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. Mark, this is like some kind of hunting ground. Whoever is doing this is using the dating apps to find their victims. Mark's face hardened with determination. We need to find out who is behind this. And we need to stop them. They gathered all the evidence they could find and returned to their room, spreading everything out on the small table. As they pored over the information, a plan began to form in their minds. We need to go back to the town, Mark said, his voice steady. We need to find out more about that figure we saw and why they were watching us. Sarah nodded, though the thought of returning to that eerie, deserted town filled her with dread. But how do we get there? The car's tires were slashed. Mark thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up. The motel probably has a maintenance shed. There might be some tools or a spare tire we can use. They left the room and made their way to the back of the motel, where they found a small shed. Inside, they found an assortment of tools and a spare tire. Mark worked quickly to replace the slashed tire while Sarah kept watch, her eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. Once the tire was replaced, they got into the car and drove back toward the town. The journey was tense, the darkness pressing in around them. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle a sign of danger. As they reached the outskirts of the town, Mark parked the car in a secluded spot, and they continued on foot. The town was just as deserted as before, the streets eerily silent. They made their way to the house where they had seen the woman, hoping to find some answers. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes staring back at them. They approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As they reached the front door, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, though her fear was palpable. "Let's do it." They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. They moved through the rooms, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the living room, they found signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned, and there were dark stains on the floor. Sarah's stomach churned as she realized what those stains might be. "Mark, look at this," she whispered, pointing to a set of footprints leading toward the basement door. They followed the footprints, their fear mounting with each step. The basement door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase. They descended slowly, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with photographs and newspaper clippings, all detailing the disappearances of people who had met someone online. In the center of the room was a large, old-fashioned trunk. Sarah's heart raced as they approached the trunk. Mark hesitated for a moment, then lifted the lid. Inside, they found a collection of personal items, jewelry, wallets, and clothing. Each item belonged to one of the missing people. This is sick," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with horror. Mark's face was grim. "We need to find out who did this. And we need to stop them." As they continued to search the basement, they found more evidence of the sinister activities that had taken place there. Detailed notes on each victim, plans for future abductions, and disturbing photographs. It was clear that whoever was behind this had been operating for a long time. Suddenly, they heard a noise from upstairs. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she realized they were not alone. "Mark, someone's here," she whispered urgently. They quickly extinguished their flashlights and hid behind a stack of boxes, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs slowly. Sarah held her breath, her body trembling with fear. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, as if sensing their presence. Sarah could barely make out their shape in the dim light, but she knew they were in danger. Just as the figure moved closer, Mark sprang into action. He grabbed a heavy object from the floor and swung it at the figure, knocking them to the ground. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the stairs. They raced up the stairs and out of the house, the figure's enraged screams echoing behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached the car, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Mark fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the doors. They jumped in and sped off, leaving the town and the horrors they had uncovered behind. As they drove through the night, the reality of what they had discovered began to sink in. They had uncovered a dark, twisted secret, but they were far from safe. Whoever was behind the disappearances was still out there, and they would stop at nothing to silence anyone who knew the truth. "We need to go to the police," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "We need to stop them." Mark nodded, his face grim. "You're right. But we need to be careful. We don't know who we can trust." They drove to the nearest town and found a small police station. Mark parked the car, and they hurried inside, their hearts pounding with fear and determination. The station was quiet, with only a few officers on duty. They approached the front desk, and Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "We need to speak to someone," she said urgently. "It's about the disappearances." The officer behind the desk looked at them skeptically. "What do you mean?" Mark stepped forward, his voice steady. "We have evidence that links the disappearances to a series of online dating profiles. We need to speak to someone in charge." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "Wait here. I'll get the detective on duty." As they waited, Sarah's mind raced with worry. What if the person they had seen in the basement followed them? What if they were still in danger? A few minutes later, a tall, stern-looking detective approached them. "I'm Detective Harris. What can I help you with?" Sarah and Mark quickly explained everything they had discovered, showing him the evidence they had gathered. Detective Harris listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "This is disturbing," he said finally. Detective Harris listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each disturbing detail Sarah and Mark revealed. The room felt colder, the air thicker with the weight of their words. When they finished, the detective nodded gravely, his face a mask of determination. "We need to move quickly," he said. "I'll assemble a team to investigate the house you described. In the meantime, you two need to stay here where it's safe." Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, relief mingling with their lingering fear. They followed Detective Harris to a small waiting room where they sank into the stiff chairs, exhaustion finally catching up with them. Hours passed, and the tension in the air only grew thicker. Sarah could feel it in her bones, a sense of foreboding that refused to let her rest. Just as she was about to doze off, the door burst open and a team of officers, led by Harris, filed in. "We found the house," Harris announced, his voice grim. "It's worse than we thought. There are more victims, many more." Sarah's stomach churned, and she clutched Mark's hand for support. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Harris met her gaze, his eyes hard with determination. "We're bringing in a forensic team to gather evidence. And we're going to find the person responsible for this." The investigation unfolded over the next few days, with Sarah and Mark staying under police protection. Each day brought new horrors to light as more evidence was uncovered, painting a chilling picture of a predator who had operated in the shadows for far too long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, there was a breakthrough. Harris burst into the room where Sarah and Mark were staying, his face flushed with excitement. "We got him," he said, his voice brimming with triumph. "We found the man behind the disappearances. He's being brought in for questioning now." Relief washed over Sarah like a wave, and she sagged against Mark, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. They had done it. They had stopped the monster. But their relief was short-lived. That night, as they lay in their beds, Sarah was jolted awake by a loud crash. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, straining to hear any other sounds. "Mark," she whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "Did you hear that?" Mark blinked groggily, then his eyes widened with alarm. "Stay here," he said, getting out of bed and grabbing a makeshift weapon, a heavy lamp from the bedside table. Sarah's fear intensified as she watched him move toward the door. She felt a cold chill run down her spine, a sense of impending doom that made her blood run cold. Just as Mark reached the door, it burst open, and a dark figure lunged at him. Mark swung the lamp, but the figure was too quick, knocking it from his hands and sending him crashing to the floor. Sarah screamed, the sound piercing the night. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely hit the buttons. "Help," she cried into the phone. "He's here. The killer is here." The line went dead, and Sarah's heart sank. She dropped the phone and ran to Mark, who was struggling to fend off the attacker. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and swung it at the intruder's head. The figure staggered, giving Mark just enough time to get to his feet. Together, they fought with a desperate ferocity, their survival instincts kicking in. But the intruder was strong, and they were losing ground. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, the door burst open again, and Detective Harris and his team rushed in, guns drawn. The intruder turned to flee, but Harris tackled him to the ground, the other officers quickly restraining him. Sarah collapsed against the wall, her body shaking with relief and terror. Mark pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as they watched the officers drag the intruder away. "It's over," Harris said, his voice reassuring. "You're safe now." The next few days were a blur of police reports, interviews, and a whirlwind of... The man who had terrorized so many was finally behind bars, and the town could begin to heal. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah and Mark tried to return to their normal lives. But the shadow of their ordeal lingered, haunting their dreams and casting a pall over their days. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Sarah's apartment, watching the sun set, Mark turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever really be free of this?" he asked softly. Sarah looked out at the fading light, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their experiences settle in her chest. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that we're stronger now. We faced something terrible, and we survived. And as long as we have each other, we can get through anything." Mark nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. He reached out and took her hand, their fingers intertwining. They sat in silence, the comforting presence of each other a balm to their frayed nerves. As the darkness fell, a sense of peace settled over them. The horrors they had faced would always be a part of them, but they had emerged from the shadows stronger and more resilient. And though the memory of their ordeal would never truly fade, they knew that they had the strength to face whatever came next together. Sarah's hands trembled as she swiped through profiles on the dating app. Each face that flickered on her screen seemed to stare back at her with vacant eyes, judging her loneliness. The glow of her phone was the only source of light in her small, cluttered apartment, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her friends had urged her to give online dating a try. "It's the best way to meet people these days," they said. But Sarah had always been hesitant. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she didn't want to end up like the countless horror stories she'd heard. Tonight, though, something felt different. There was a sense of unease in the air, as if the universe was whispering warnings she couldn't quite understand. She took a deep breath and continued swiping. Then she saw him. His name was Mark, and his profile was unremarkable at first glance. Brown hair, blue eyes, a friendly smile. But there was something in his eyes that drew her in. They seemed to hold secrets, depths that she couldn't resist exploring. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the like button. She shrugged off her apprehension and tapped the screen. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a new message. "Hi Sarah, nice to meet you. Your profile caught my eye. Would you like to chat?" Her heart skipped a beat. She typed a quick reply, and before she knew it, they were deep in conversation. Mark was charming, witty, and attentive. He seemed genuinely interested in her, asking questions about her life, her interests, and her dreams. They chatted late into the night, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Days turned into weeks, and their conversations grew more intimate. They shared their fears, their pasts, and their hopes for the future. Mark seemed perfect, almost too perfect. But Sarah pushed aside her doubts, convincing herself that she deserved to be happy. One evening, as they were chatting, Mark suggested they meet in person. Sarah's heart raced with excitement and anxiety. She agreed, and they made plans to meet at a cozy little cafe in the city. The night of their date, Sarah stood in front of her mirror, nervously adjusting her outfit. She wanted to look perfect for Mark, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She shook her head, dismissing her fears as predate jitters, and headed out the door. The cafe was dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background.